So they're in a freezing prison cell in the most appalling circumstances, half-starved to death. He finds freedom in himself. He finds something positive and something to live for by first coming to grips with evil and understanding what it is. Well, there's a conundrum in there.
And he said too, like, and he underwent the Christian process of metanoia, which is to go over it's confession essentially and repentance. It wasn't mediated by a religious structure in Solzhenitsyn's case, but it was exactly the same process, and he knew that perfectly well. I'm not making this up. He said when he was in the prisons and decided that he was at least in part to blame for his own imprisonment and the imprisonment of everyone around him, that was his fault, or at least both his fault and his responsibility, that he was going to take that on. He said the first thing he did was he went over his life with a fine-tooth comb in memory. And his goal was, okay, I'm going to remember everything I did in my life up to now where I did something that I knew to be wrong. And not because of some external authority defining it as wrong, but in relationship to his own conscience, right? And then he was going to determine if there was some way that could be rectified now, to atone for it, right? To become at one with it again. And so that was part of the process he undertook. And the concluding consequence of that was that he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which is an absolutely overwhelming piece that blew the intellectual slats out of the foundation of communism permanently, right? Once Solzhenitsyn published...
Until now, we seem to be trying to gloss over it.
Yeah,
Academia seems to be full of people who want to soft pedal that and reinstitute this naive view that if we just create the right institutions, everybody will behave rationally, we'll all be equal, everything will be okay. They want to enforce it. They won't say that, but that's what they want to do. They want to enforce it.
Yeah, well, I think it's easier...
And it's only a few short decades since all of that happened.
Yeah, well...
Are we mad?
Well, we're characterized by inertia and ignorance. It's not easy to understand history. It's especially not if you read it properly. You know, I had a client at one point who was an unbelievably naive person. You cannot overestimate her naivety, no matter how hard you tried. Her parents taught her that adults were angels, literally. And she believed that in a strange sense. When I met her, she was in her 20s. And she had this extraordinarily naive view of people and had been hurt. And if you're very naive and you've been hurt by someone, you often disintegrate because it blows your world apart, and that's what had happened to her. And I said, she had a university degree, and I said, well, look, like in the liberal arts, I said, didn't you read any history? And she said, well, yeah. And I said, well, didn't that disturb the whole adults are angels hypothesis? And she said, well, I read it, but I just compartmentalized it. And that gave me the key to what was wrong with her, and we successfully dealt with it. But I had her to begin her process of cure, oddly enough, because she had to understand malevolence, because she had been touched by it, right? She had to understand it because her naive worldview had been shattered by the hand of malevolence. I had her read a book called Ordinary Men by Browning, and it's a study of these Polish policemen, German policemen who were sent to Poland after the Nazis had marched through Poland, and they were sent to police Poland, and they were, you know, decent middle-class guys, essentially, most of whom had been hit maturity before Hitler had come to power, so they weren't indoctrinated Nazis, you know, not like the Nazi youth types were, and they had to go to Poland and be policemen under wartime conditions. And they had a very humane commander, and he told all of them that they were going to have to do things that would be far more brutal in all likelihood than they were normally prepared to do in their role as non-military policemen, but that they could go back to their old job if they wanted to. So it wasn't top-down enforcement of an authoritarian ethos. And Browning documents their transformation from the guy next door, you know, the policeman next door, into people who were taking naked pregnant women out into fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And it's a brutal book because, well, these men, it's like, it just ruined them to do that to themselves. They were physically ill during the process of transformation, you know, and he does a very good job of documenting how an ordinary person transforms into a Nazi murderer. And I had to read that. I said, but don't you compartmentalize it. This is about you, right? This isn't about someone else. When you read history, you think, well, that's about someone else. It's like, unless maybe you're a victim and you identify with the victims. It's a very rare person who reads history and identifies with the perpetrators. But unless you read history and identify with the perpetrators, then you don't understand history at all. And so who wants to understand that? And I get my students, I said, look, I've told them this for 30 years. Here's something you have to understand. If you were in Nazi Germany, the statistical probability is overwhelming that you would have been a perpetrator. Right? You think you would have rescued Anne Frank. It's like, think again. Those people are very, 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 very rare. They put their lives on the line to do that. They put their families' lives on the line to do that. You think you're one of those people? Really? It's like that. All that means is that you know nothing. You know nothing about yourself. You know nothing about people. You know nothing about politics or economics or history. It's a harsh lesson. But
the truth about Germany in the 1930s, it was probably the most educated society the world had seen to that point in time. Education alone, cleverness in inverted commas alone, intelligence alone.
Sophisticated civilization alone. No, right. Yes, so, absolutely. There's no substitute for character.
So we don't want, it's Pascal talked of the glory and the scum. To reach our full humanity, it seems to me we need to understand both intention.
Now, Carl Jung
the unbelievable scum that lies in terms of our potential at the bottom of every heart. The extraordinary nobility, you call it the spark of divinity, I would say made in the image of a mighty creator. You've got to hold those things in suspension if you're to find your real humanity. And in fact, the way through to the good place is surely through the valley of darkness in the first place.
Well, then you think, well, if it's possible to be enlightened, why isn't everyone enlightened? It's like, well, you don't get to paradise, you don't get to heaven without harrowing hell first, right? And who's going to do that? Like, that's a terrible thing to do. It isn't even clear that you can survive it. No, I mean, it's brutally damaging to come to terms with your own proclivity for malevolence, and so people don't do it, and it's no wonder. But the funny thing is, and this is also something that I think that people who've been watching my lectures have been attracted by, especially the young men. It's like, until you understand that you're a monster, until perhaps you even develop that as a capacity, you don't have the moral force to do good. And so not only is that descent to begin with necessary to scare you straight, right, to make you understand what exactly it is that you're dealing with, but you don't even have the strength of character to be good until you understand just exactly what sort of monster you can be. I have a rule in my book, Rule 5. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
Yeah, I read it.
It's a meditation on the monstrousness of parents. It's like, don't underestimate yourself, your capability to ruin your children's lives. You let them act in a manner that makes you disapprove of them. You will take revenge on them in ways you cannot even imagine. And unless you understand that, you're not going to be careful enough as a parent, and you're not going to set proper boundaries. Don't let your children annoy you. It's a very bad idea. Now, that means that you should try to regulate your proclivity to be annoyed, and you should try to be civilized, and you should talk to your partner, your wife, or your husband about your oversensitivities and foolishnesses. But having said that, you need to know who the monster is, and it's you. So
if we're washing that wisdom out, I don't want to sound condemnatory here, I'm more sympathetic and concerned for what's happening in our family homes and the environment in which our kids are being raised. And you and I mean, you're very passionate in your concern for these people, so we don't want anyone to think here that we're trying to condemn them. Far the opposite, just the opposite. But if we're washing this out of the system, what then happens to our kids when they hit institutions, schools, colleges, universities?
Well, we're going to find out, because increasingly the elementary and the school systems that our kids are going through from, say, the age of 5 to the age of 18, they're increasingly occupied by the postmodern neo-Marxist ideologies. I think we have to learn to identify what those are. That's a start. I mean, there's buzzwords: diversity, inclusivity, equity. Equity, that's That's a no-go zone, equity. That's equality of outcome. That's a preposterous, murderous doctrine masquerading in sheep's clothing. White privilege, systemic racism, gender, all of those. None of those as individual topics are necessarily off the table. You can have an intelligent discussion about any of them except equity, because that's just a no-go zone. But to see those concepts emerge as a network of meaning, you know that you're in the presence of this pernicious postmodern neo-Marxist doctrine that's fundamentally ideological at its core. And people need to see that, and they need to understand what that means, and they need to stop it. Now, how they're going to stop it, they're going to make a million individual decisions about that, but at least they could start by identifying it. I've suggested to parents in Canada, in the US, that as soon as teachers talk to their children about diversity, inclusivity, and equity, that they suggest to their children that they leave the class, because they're no longer in the educational realm, they're in the indoctrination realm. And people aren't taking that, I wouldn't say they're not taking that seriously. It's not an easy thing to figure out, and it sounds very, very radical to suggest, encouraging your children to leave the class. But I think we're at that point.
I wonder why our universities are not offering high-quality courses in how freedom was secured by Western societies for its individual member people, and how it might be secured, and how you secured fairness from unfairness. Those sorts of things are not there.
Well, I think some of it has to do with what we've been speaking about, is that to address the problem squarely is actually quite daunting. I mean,
yes.
The difficulties are manifold. Inequality is real. Individual malevolence is real. To constrain it inside yourself is extraordinarily daunting. To read history as a perpetrator is traumatizing. These are hard things. And then to think through the problems of addressing something like inequality instead of reacting to it in a knee-jerk, compassionate manner and implement policies on that basis that are going to be counterproductive, that's also extraordinarily difficult. So there's difficulty as part of it. And then I would also say, well, we haven't talked about the resentment that drives the discussion of inequality. It's not like everyone on the left is overwhelmed by compassion, and that's why all these brutal things tend to happen. It's that they're also overwhelmed by the same sort of jealousy that Cain had for Abel, and the same sort of murderous impulses that emerge very rapidly as a consequence of that jealousy. He has more than me. He must be a perpetrator. It's morally obligatory for me to take him out. Well, that's an easy message to sell. I read about how the communists dekulakized the Russian countryside. So imagine, it's Russia. You're in a village. It's 30 years, something like that, after the serfs have been emancipated. There's a few agriculturalists who've managed to produce successful agricultural enterprises. And, maybe they have a couple of cows, they have some land, they're able to hire a few people, and they're raising almost all the food, right? And they're a minority in any village, because the hyper-productive successful are always a minority. So they're a minority in every village. All right, and there's people who are doing worse, and then there's a lot of people who aren't doing so well at all. And then the communist intellectuals show up, and they tell the people who aren't doing so well, some of whom are just suffering because of life, but some of whom aren't doing well because they've never done anything productive with even a second of their life. And the communist intellectuals come in and say, those guys that are doing so much better than you? Yeah, they actually stole all of that from you. And you're morally obligated to go take it back. It's like, oh man, after 6 cups of mead, let's say 10, or let's say 20, and I'm drunk out of my mind, and I've got my cruel buddies with me, and we're all resentful right to the core because we've wasted our miserable lives, and now we have an opportunity to go down the street to our wealthy neighbor's house and to rape his daughters, and we can do it in the name of good. It's like, well, there's a story you can market. And that happened everywhere in the Soviet Union. And so they wiped out the kulaks. It's like, great. And then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death.
Yeah.